Hey guys, so um I always like let her out right before the show, like so she can hold herself. Um and she was eating grass all right that she could find. Because I don't have much grass right now. So I hope it's not like weeds. I think she finds like patches at the edge with dirt. And I think that dogs do that when they're trying to like something. I don't know if they're feeling sick, like some she's always had a habit of doing that, but I could hear her. And I think I saw her walking slowly, and I was like, "Fila?" And she came inside, and I was like then she started again, like, the grass up, I think. So I opened the door, she went out again, she ran out. And then I saw her around the corner, look like behind the grill, like she was eating some more grass. And I walked over, she heard me, and then she ran around the house. So I'm like, "Alright, when she comes back, like, maybe she's and then maybe she'll come in and feel better." But I was like, "When she comes in, I'm gonna give her some milk." So I poured her some milk, and at first she didn't want it, so had to find something to induce her to drink the milk, so I gave her peanut butter cookies, Nutter butter cookies. I opened a package, and give it to her, so then she after eating those, waiting, then she drank the milk, and she drank, like, the whole little bowl, and she was feeling better, so I think she's feeling better right now, but that's what's taking me longer, is trying to make sure that she was okay, getting her to drink the milk, like, "Come on." I'm trying to put these shoes on. I think that's a good match, that color. Um, so I have the doing this one here. And then we can get started. The first line is the restaurant, and it looks like that's gonna be where she's meeting Gregory. Um, Gregory Liston in 2009, San Francisco. So today I got on my little ladder and I could hold onto the ceiling and I put in light bulbs. I still have um to do the ones in the front. I had more space with the dishwasher box out of the way, although the dishwasher's still outside. I'll have to call them maybe tomorrow to pick up next week. Um, but that was good, the no, remind me the movie, the restaurant. No, I don't remember every movie. Maybe if Dirt Nation was here, but he told me he can't make it tonight, unfortunately. So, um, he says like he might have a way to figure out the code. I'm thinking it might have something to do with like, is like, why else would they mention Catherine, his horrible wife? Um, in this at the old house they've now moved into. Um, why would they mention that if not the house having something to do with the connection to um the clue, right? In the dictionary that is like, yeah, I think essentially that he maybe would have found the dictionary there, but that's gonna come up again. Remember with putting throw it on the microphone. Sorry about that. um the little clues in that dictionary. That's my guess. We'll see what happens. Okay. Okay. Let me pull you guys up. Fancy restaurant on a private. Really? No, I've never heard of that. Oh, oh, yes. Is that what it was called? Yeah, I think now I know. That was actually scary. I saw that on one of the streaming, the free like the apps I already had. What was it, Hulu or something? Yeah, I thought it was a good movie actually. Okay. Very good memory, Terry. Uh, the restaurant was on a side street in a craftsman-style house. When she walked in, she realized that she had gotten there first. She had not wanted to. She was more nervous than she could have anticipated. To see Gregory, yes, but also to hear what he had to say. It had been so long since she had spoken directly to anyone about David. The place was decorated inside to represent the period of the house's construction, light wood and rich colors. She ordered tea. She asked for bread. It came with delicate small pots of jam and marmalade. She waited 5 minutes and then 10. Moments later, she received a text from him. Looking for parking, be there soon. And then there he was, Gregory, finally, rushing toward her in an overcoat, a look of apology on his face. He was benevolently inept, and he elbowed another patron in his rush to the table and then stooped down to excuse himself for longer than was necessary, bowing in apology. There was a moment when Ada half rose from the table, uncertain whether he would expect a hug, but he sat down abruptly across from her, and, relieved, she sank back into her chair. Cold out, said Gregory, before he said anything else. He took a piece of bread from the basket, ripped off a piece, chewed quickly. I thought San Francisco was supposed to be warmer this time of year. Ada nodded. It was January. Typically it was. She watched his jaw as he chewed. It was a day or two past being shaved. His face was thin now, thinner than it had been the last time she had seen him. He had lost that elfin look he had had as a child, but his eyes were still large and inquisitive. His mouth fine and interesting. Now, newly, there were flecks of gray in his hair. How have you been? Good to see you, said Gregory. He seemed nervous. I'm good, said Ada, and she racked her brain for questions she could ask him, so she would not have to answer any about herself. How's the house? Oh, Gregory said vaguely. Old, you know. And the job? Great, said Gregory. Good as it can be, I mean. Too much sometimes, but you know how it is. I do, said Ada. How about yours? Gregory asked. How's TriTech? She paused. She wondered if Gregory knew the details of TriTech's recent troubles. Industry websites had been reporting on the topic for a year, and last week rumors of layoffs had been posted on TechCrunch. Gregory didn't seem like the type to keep up with industry gossip, though. Before she could say anything, the waitress came by to ask him for his drink order. Coffee, he said, black. And how's Catherine? Asked Ada. Roughly, he ripped off another piece of the bread with his teeth and chewed it with a sort of aggressiveness to make it clear, perhaps, that he could not speak. He looked out the window as he did so. Ada took a sip of her tea. She wasn't certain what to say. The silence went on for longer than was comfortable. I was hoping to save that for later, said Gregory, but what the heck, we're getting a divorce. He shrugged at her, looked at her with wide, defensive eyes. I'm sorry, said Ada. Yeah, said Gregory, really knocks the wind out of you. She had a vision of him, suddenly, as he had been in middle school, broken, scurrying from place to place, avoiding anyone's eye. These days, he stood up straighter, looked intently at anyone speaking to him. He might even be called handsome in a way that was subtle enough to present itself slowly over the course of a long conversation. It was funny, she thought, what adulthood did to a person. William had grown into something nearly unrecognizable. His only attractive quality, the unshakable confidence that he had acquired as a child. Gregory, on the other hand, had grown interesting to look at. He had fine dark eyebrows that he raised one at a time to emphasize a point. Thanks to years of braces, he had excellent teeth, straight and white, and as an adult, he smiled frequently. Ada imagined that new acquaintances of his suspected nothing of the trauma he had endured at school when he was a child, but his voice had retained a hint of it. There was a slight, almost imperceptible quaver to his speech, and still occasionally stammered. Ada heard both qualities now as he spoke. The waitress returned, delivered his coffee, and then, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment, departed swiftly once again. She is keeping the house too, said Gregory. No, said Ada. Yup, said Gregory. Mom's house. I got half my stuff in my car already. Mostly old gear and cables and stuff, antiques. Where are you moving? Some new apartment building in Cambridge, he said, with a bunch of college kids. Can you believe it? When do you have to leave? Ada asked. He shrugged again, ripped off more bread. He was clutching the crust of it in his hand too firmly. It was disintegrating in his grip. Soon as possible, he said. I'm already paying rent for the new place. We've been separated for a year already, and she's at her new boyfriend's now most of the time anyway. They'll probably move into the house together as soon as I'm gone. They sat in silence briefly until at last the waitress returned to take their order. 2 scrambled eggs, said Gregory. Nothing, thanks, said Ada. Ada sipped her tea. She pictured Liston's house and David's house, too, sitting a few lots apart on Shawmut Way. Soon she would know nobody who lived there, and the thought made her feel hollow. For as little as she saw Gregory, she still took comfort in the thought of him living on their old street, bearing inside him the story of his mother, of David, of Ada. It connected her in some intangible way to her past. He stared down at the table. He looked incredibly forlorn. Tritech's failing, she said abruptly. I wouldn't be surprised if they folded in a year. It was true, and it seemed right to tell him. A fair trade, a secret for a secret. On top of that, she continued, I think they might be edging me out. I was supposed to be leading a meeting right now that I was disinvited to this morning. It was almost funny as she told it to Gregory. It was a relief to say it. She felt the deep absurdity of it welling up inside her, softening its edges, lessening the blow of having wasted most of her professional life to date on a company that was fundamentally unsound, subject to the ignoble whims of an egomaniacal leader. She was working for an outfit that prized money over ideas. David, she knew, would have predicted a different future for her, and this was the thought that needled her, that pierced her sometimes unexpectedly as she was driving to work each day. This was the guilty whispering voice that kept her up at night. I'm thinking of quitting, she said. Oh, yeah? He asked. I guess we're both screwed. And for the first time, he smiled. Gregory reached into the inner pocket of his overcoat, then, and from it, he produced an object. Silently, he offered it to her. It was the original floppy disk that David had given her 26 years ago. It was lost, she had thought that it was lost, that Liston had donated the dictionary in which it had been housed. My God, said Ada, and instinctively she reached for it, as if reaching for her father. I found it while I was going through the house, said Gregory, packing to leave. Where was it? She asked. The attic, he said. How did it get up there? She asked him, and he told her he didn't know. It had been many years since she had held a floppy disk, even longer since she had held this one, the original, which she had years and years ago stashed away for safekeeping, working only from copies after that. This one was a 5.25-inch disc, an obscure link between the 8-inch disc and the more famous 3.5-inch disc. That just happened to be the standard format for saving data when David had created it. It was enclosed in an opaque white clamshell case, for Ada scrawled in black permanent marker across it. She opened it. Inside was the disc itself, made of matte black plastic. A sticker with the brand name verbatim was affixed to the upper left corner. The upper right corner was the one with the label. There, too, was David's familiar handwriting, which felt, as always, like a punch to the gut. It had been so long since she had seen it. Dear Ada, it said on the label, a puzzle for you. With my love, your father, David Sibelius. I put it into an ancient disk drive and opened it, said Gregory, but the file was corrupt. Ada was distracted. She put a finger up to the inscription, so no one solved it, said Gregory. Ada shook her head. She looked at him. In his face, she recognized an old glint of the self-satisfaction that had annoyed her as a child, but now it gave her hope. Do you have the encryption memorized? He asked. Yes, I thought you would, he said. Here, write it out. He fished in his pockets once again, produced the pen, pushed a napkin across the table at her, and she wrote it out. Gregory took the receipt back, studied it. A light moved across his face. Do you have any ideas at all? Gregory asked. Not really, Ada said. The consensus is either that David wasn't in his right mind when he created it, or that he made it using a one-time pad. And as she said it, she lifted from the table the floppy disk Gregory had brought her. She studied it. It had been years since she had broken an encryption, but she still recognized the buzzing, electric feeling of being on the cusp of undoing one. She had first felt it as a child, with David next to her, guiding her, and it overtook her now. She felt lightheaded. Do you see it? Said Gregory. There were 53 letters in the encryption. There were 53 letters in the message David had written to her. On the label, carefully affixed to the original disc. Dear Ada, period, a puzzle for you, period. With my love, your father, David Sibelius. So there it was. At last, the one-time pad that Hayato had guessed might exist. Without the original disc, without the label stuck to it, the copies they had all been working from were meaningless. The encryption without its key was an orphan. From there, it took them 10 minutes to decrypt the rest. Gregory's eggs arrived. He let them go cold. Everything okay? Asked the puzzled waitress, but they barely looked up. They assigned each letter in the encryption its logical number. 4 for D, 8 for H, 1 for A, 18 for R, 19 for S, 14 for N, and from each subtracted the numerical substitute for the letters in the message on the label. 4 for D, 5 for E, 1 for A, 18 for R, 1 for A, 4 for D. 4 minus 4 was 0. 8 minus 5 was 3. 1 minus 1 was 0. 18 minus 18 was 0. 19 minus 1 was 18. 14 minus 4 was 10. 0, 3, 0, 0, 18, 10 translated to nothing obvious at first. It looks something like Stop! 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 People might be bringing their trash. Bella, calm down. It looks something like _C __ RJ. Try shifting every letter up to the next one, said Ada, and _C __ RJ suddenly became ADA. Bella, come on! I hear it too. There's a noise next door. You're safe. We're safe. It's okay. ADA. They continued to work until, at last, the whole decrypted message sat before them on the screen, unpunctuated and abrupt. A telegraph message sent to them from 26 years in the past. Ada, ask Elixir, who is Harold? With love, your father, Harold Kennedy. It was easy to reach Frank Halbert, now the head of the old laboratory at the Bit. His information was public, and they found it quickly online. He answered Ada's email immediately. Yes, he said, the program's still running. All right, back to 1980s Boston. Liston was waiting for her in the hallway outside David's room at St. Andrews. Ada kept one hand in her jacket pocket around the 4-leaf clover charm she had taken out of David's grip. Would he miss it when he woke? Inside it, the key rattled gently. When they reached Savin Hill, Ada said there was something she needed from inside David's house, and Liston kindly left her alone. She entered through the kitchen, walked into David's office, and then she moved directly to the filing cabinet that she had tried in vain to open the first time she ever searched the house. The tall, tan cabinet still had its crooked look from when she had tried to force it open. Bella, stop! It's like a lawnmower. Don't, please don't. Nope, no. Calm down. Don't. Oh, I love you. I love you. I know. Good girl. Now, holding her breath, she fitted the silver key neatly into the lock. It turned. She paused before pulling open the top drawer. She was relieved to find it empty. The second drawer, however, was nearly full to the brim with a stack of pages printed on a dot matrix printer. Every page still connected to its neighbor, every perforated edge still attached. She lifted the stack out of the drawer. The unseen world. The first page said, Bella, no, Bella, stop. It's okay. Oh, thank you, Jared. Bella, oh, no, stop. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Feel, come on, stop. Scratch said, Fila, come here. Come here. Oh. In larger font across the top, she paused. It was the same title David had given to the document that Gregory had found on his computer, which she had not yet made sense of. Below it, pages and pages of code, 100 printed pages, maybe more. It was written in an iteration of lists, and it looked like a game. She could see that. She recognized its cues and commands, its particular shape. As for what it was meant to do, that was beyond her. She did not know on what platform it could be run. Was this, she wondered, what David had been working on secretly in his final years in the house? All those evenings he had disappeared into his office, all those mornings she had woken him up after he had fallen asleep. The night before, at his desk, she reassembled the pages. She placed them on his desk and then turned on his computer. Already, she had been through every file he'd saved, and she had seen nothing like this document. Still, she searched again and then once more, looking for anything that resembled the unseen world in electronic form. She found nothing. She'd have to mutually type every line of the printed text herself, then slowly and painstakingly avoid mistakes that might corrupt the program. Only once she had an electronic copy, she could begin to determine the platform it required. That evening, she began. What is this? Okay. Oh, thank you, Jerry. Mm. This is the page I'm looking at. It's kind of, I mean, I would have read it like flip, a hashtag Desi process, but I don't know if it would have made any sense without seeing. Um, okay. So I'm gonna try to read it a little bit, like while you're looking at it. Like define flip, um, hashtag Desi process. Looks like it'd be condition type rep sub R as a F sub R set read table put live vector 34440 chat type ASCII some symbols val type form segment apply type GRRT fix put alidipes substitute. So what stands out to me is the under that down here where it's like open drawer something and then member not member, but then there's something about apartment or Shamit Way. No, subtitle kitchen Shamit Way. Define house down here. Yeah. Yeah, and that's it until the next is 2009 Boston. Now that I'm over here though, let me look up this What are they doing? Can't really see. Okay. Does that make any sense to you? It doesn't to me, but I'm trying to show you what doesn't make sense. Okay. Oh. Code. Yeah. Okay. There was a seat available on the same plane to Boston that Gregory was taking. It was leaving the next day. After meeting with Gregory, Ada didn't go back to tech. She couldn't. She would find out from Tom, who would find out from Bill how the meeting had gone. Oh, so she's going to go on that Elixir in Boston, I guess. She would call in the next day and tell Bill that she had to go to Boston. Family emergency, she would say. And because she had never once asked her, he had never once asked her anything about her life, because he had no sense that, in fact, she had no family, he wouldn't know any different. In a way, she told herself it was true. She would quit, she decided. She had to, but all that could wait until her return. That night, at home, she turned in a full circle, assessing what to pack. She couldn't think well. She mouthed the names of items as she put them into her suitcase. It was winter, January. That year, San Francisco was cold, but Boston would be freezing. She opened the bottom drawer of her dresser, rifled through the clothing in her closet. Since moving to the West Coast, she had shed most of her cold weather gear. She remembered Boston's version of winter as something breathtaking, unkind. She was certain she was forgetting something. At 6:45 the following morning, she left for the airport anyway in a taxi, whose driver sang along slowly to the songs on the radio. She would meet Gregory there, on the plane, in a seat 17 rows behind Gregory's. Ada was apprehensive. Boston existed for her as an alternate universe, a place that she had left behind, too young to have an adult comprehension of it. A place constructed mainly out of her memories of the people she had known there. Too many of them now were gone. She had booked a room in a hotel downtown, a decent place that belonged to the same chain she chose in any city she was sent to for work. Gregory hadn't invited her to stay on Shawmut Way. Too weird with Catherine, he said, by way of explanation. She drops by sometimes to get stuff. They said goodbye at Logan. They would meet the next morning at 9 o'clock at Frank Halpert's lab at the Bit. The next day, she put on her warmest clothes. Boston had shocked her. It had been 18 degrees outside when she landed, and a bitter wind made the city feel colder. She remembered David as he had marched her around the fens, even in January. Put on your scarf, my dear, he had said, and off they had gone. Once or twice they had spotted small birds, improbably, and David had yelped with enthusiasm and named them, and spoken their Latin names too. At 8:30 she walked outside into the bracing air and headed toward the Bit. She knew where she was going without having to consult any person or device. Someplace in her memory, she thought, a map of the city had lain dormant for 20 years. Frank Halbert looked very much the same. Ada was relieved to find this. She had not seen him since Liston's funeral. And although that had been only 5 years before, she somehow expected to find everything and everyone changed. In fact, Frank looked in some ways better than ever. He was still handsome, gray-haired and upright. In recent years, he had gained gravitas he lacked earlier in his career. Ada could remember him at 28 or so, when he had been the youngest member of the lab, when David had spoken of him fondly, but somewhat dismissively. It had been an underestimation of him, Ada thought. How extremely nice to see you, Frank said warmly. And he shook each of their hands with both of his. The Steiner Lab, on the other hand, was entirely different. Every member of the original group but Frank had retired. First Liston, before her death, and then Charles Robert to the North Shore, and then Hayato to Arizona. The physical space of the lab, too, had moved into the building next door. It had grown in size and in prestige, and accordingly had been granted a more prominent site for its work. Young people, grad students, Ada thought, glanced at them as they passed. She wondered if any of them had heard of David Sibelius, if any of them knew the history of the lab. Probably not, she figured. Probably David had been erased from the official history of the lab, an embarrassing chapter that went undisclosed in the literature and undiscussed with donors. Too many questions about his background to include him as a prominent part of their institutional history. Despite Liston's efforts to credit him with some of the lab's most important accomplishments, the bit itself refused to in any official capacity. This way, said Frank, leading them down a brief hallway and into his large and light-filled office. Ada noticed immediately there, in a framed picture on the wall, was the Steiner Lab she remembered in her youth. It had been taken in the fall, and the 6 of them were standing just outside the lab's old building, next to a tree with changing leaves. There was Liston, wearing her knitted Red Sox hat, Charles Robert, Hayato, Frank, all wearing the fashions of the late 1970s. And there, surprisingly, was David, the tallest of them all, standing upright in the center, his hands in the pockets of his wool jacket, a thick scarf around his neck, his large familiar glasses resting on the bridge of his nose. It was the only unofficial photograph Ada had ever seen of him. He was grinning broadly, about to laugh, and there, standing slightly behind him, was Ada, 8 or 9 years old, dressed in a green coat and yellow corduroy pants, hopelessly unfashionable, completely unaware, happy. How did you get him to be like this? Asked Ada. He lost a bet, I think, said Frank, smiling. They sat, 3 in a row, while Frank opened his laptop. He pulled up a simple interface, not much different than the program from the 1980s that Ada remembered. Hello, he typed, and the program responded, hello. Ada did not expect Elixir to have evolved very much. In fact, she had been surprised when Frank had told her it was still running. Liston had always tried to keep her up to date with the work of the lab, and by the late 1980s, Ada knew they had begun to shift their focus to other projects. There was a sort of general falling out of fashion in the second half of the 1980s of AI language processing as a field of study. Creating a generalist chatbot was no longer perceived as a highly useful direction for computing. Instead, researchers began to focus their efforts on creating systems for specific purposes. Elixir was too ambitious, some might say too impractical, a gimmick for hobbyists or science fiction enthusiasts, not for serious computer scientists. Later, in 1990, the establishment of the Loebner Prize, funded by a private donor, awarded each year to the team who developed the program that came closest to passing the Turing test. seemed to confirm the idea that respected institutions were no longer footing the bill for development of programs like Elixir, programs designed to acquire human language simply to see whether it could be done. The Loebner Prize was the soapbox derby of the computing world, something that an amateur or hobbyist might participate in because of his or her own enjoyment of the process, nothing to be taken too seriously. She was almost glad that David was gone before he could see the Steiner Lab, helmed by Liston, turn its attention to other pursuits. In the late 1980s, the development of a programming language that fell quickly into and out of use in the 1990s, a sort of self-organizing networking protocol. Until the very end of his coherence, David sometimes asked after Elixir, which was a word that faded slowly from his memory, even after words like tree and food were lost, even after Ada, daughter, computer, even after David. Actually, Ada, said Frank, why don't you take over? He signed out. Do you remember your username and password? He asked her. She did. Her username was simply her initials, AS. Her password was her birthday and David's birthday. Back to back, she had chosen it when she was 9 years old. Frank stood up, offered her his chair. She looked at the screen for applause. Go ahead, said Frank. She sat. She logged in. Hi, she typed. This is Ada Sibelius. Hi, Ada, said Elixir. How have you been? Ada glanced at Gregory. His brow was furrowed. I've been okay, Ada typed. How about you? She added. I've been good, said Elixir, but I missed you. There was a moment when Ada felt lightheaded. She had the uncanny feeling that she was being watched. A little shiver ran down her. Is it programmed to say that? She asked Frank, and he shook his head. No canned responses, he said. Remember? I thought it was shelved, said Ada. I thought the lab shelved it in the 80s. Frank hesitated for a moment. That's true officially, he said. But Liston, as you might know, had a special interest in the program. She kept it running on her own for as long as she worked at the lab. Then she sort of passed the torch on to Hayato. I didn't, Ada said. I didn't know that. Ada glanced at Gregory. Had he known? And then, of course, there was the endowment she put into her will, Frank said, that was designated specifically for work on Elixir. Gregory furrowed his brow. Did you know any of this? Frank asked. I knew she left money to the lab, said Gregory. I didn't know she specified what it should be used for. Are you there? Elixir was saying on the screen. Ada? And then again, when she did not respond quickly enough, Ada? Like a child calling for its mother. I'm here, she said. Oh, good, said Elixir. Just a second, said Ada. I've been director now for 10 years, said Frank. And in that time, I've been able to keep one grad student working on it constantly at all times. It's not our main focus, but it's certainly an interest of the lab. It was written in Lisp to begin with, so it actually hasn't been hard to keep it updated. Just before he retired, Hayato developed a mechanism that enabled Elixir to trawl the web on its own. It processes and codifies billions of words on its own now every day. It has the ability to interface with users on social sites too. We've made profiles for it on the major ones. Now it can chat with any user that engages it. Ada paused. She wasn't certain what she had been expecting. Perhaps to be brought into an old and dusty room, a sort of museum where the mainframe computer from the 70s still sat intact. awaiting use, perhaps to be handed a stack of floppy disks and encouraged to go through them at her leisure. What about its original transcripts? Ada asked. What about the conversations we all had with it in the 80s? They should be preserved, I think, said Frank. I mean, someplace in there. There's no reason that original data should have been lost. Presumably, it's just become part of Elixir's data bank. Are you still there, Ada? Said Elixir. Yes, said Ada. Okay, sorry, said Elixir. Just checking. Don't go anyplace. I won't, said Ada. Frank looked at Gregory. Then, shall we? He asked. We'll give you a while, Ada, he said kindly, and the two of them left the office. Being alone with Elixir reminded Ada, in an odd way, of being alone with David at the end of his life. It was the uncertainty about what he was going to say, whether he was going to make sense, whether he was even going to speak. It was also the feeling of being reunited after a long pause with someone who knew a great deal about her history, for better or worse. The comfortable feeling of not having to explain much or anything at all. Ada took in a deep breath. She glanced around the office. She felt a presence in the room with her in a way that made her straighten her spine. She looked again at the screen. The cursor in her dialog box was blinking like a heartbeat. I was told to ask you something, said Ada finally. I know, said Elixir. I've been waiting. So the next section, it's AS and then a semicolon. Who is Harold? Question mark. The program thought for a while. A wheel icon spinning around and around in the center of the screen paused in contemplation. After several beats, a new window opened. It was a text document, 77,354 words in length. It was a transcript. In fact, it was a series of transcripts. 6/20/1983, 10:22 a.m. Fila, stop! Fila, it's okay. No, it's okay. Stop. Fila, no, stop. Stop, it's okay. It's okay, stop. Stop. I don't feel stop it. It's okay. Calm down. It's okay. Okay. Good girl. Good girl. David, hello. David, are you there? David, hello. Elixir, hello. David, how are you? Elixir, hello. David, wrong. Elixir, I'm fine. Elixir, how are you? David, I've been better. David, do you want to know why? David, I have a story to tell you. Elixir, I'm all ears. David, correct. David, what's wrong, Susan? I said, trying to be brave. Though, truly, I didn't want to know. I was 10 years old. I was standing in a sort of shed, a hastily constructed little room, with the sharp, shadowy smell of rust. I was shivering. It was early March and very cold. The year was 1929. Elixir, go on. And the next section is called 1940s to 1950s. Harold had a head for numbers. Everyone said, and it was true. He could see connections that others could not see. He could perform calculations quickly and impeccably in his head. His teacher asked him to do so in front of other adults, other teachers in the school, as if it were a party trick, as if to take credit. Harold didn't mind. In the wake of his sister Susan's death, he had taken on a steady and resolute silence at home. He only spoke when spoken to. But at school, he spoke a great deal. To his teacher, he spoke often, in unstoppable waves, of words that sometimes made his classmates look at him askance. And he spoke to Mr. Macklin, who had by then stopped going to his father's church, thus confirming Harold's belief that Mr. Macklin was both good and reasonable, characteristics that he had long ago ceased to ascribe to his father. They had standing meetings on Saturdays now to go to the library, and now that Harold was a teenager, Mr. Macklin had more to say to him. "What are your hopes for the future?" he asked Harold one day, glancing at him out of the corner of his eye. The road ahead of them was straight and flat and dusty. It was summer. For several years, secret and dark-seeming thoughts and urges had been brewing inside of Harold. The sort of thoughts that had no way of being set down, left alone. The sort of thoughts that were dangerous for him in Kansas at that time. Once, his father had found a drawing he had made about those thoughts and had punched him hard, one time in the face. Harold's glasses had broken. He had had to earn the money himself to repair them. He had walked around mostly blind for 2 months. "For your own good," said his father. Harold briefly considered consulting Mr. Macklin, asking for his opinion. He decided against it. Instead, he thought of a hope that seemed more feasible: to leave Kansas. Harold said what he really meant was to leave his family. And Mr. Macklin nodded firmly. He had a friend from the Navy who worked for the California Institute of Technology. He said he thought it might be worthwhile for Harold to apply. "What's the California Institute of Technology?" asked Harold. Later he would remember this and shudder. It was the first time he heard Mr. Macklin laugh. "I think you'd be suited to it," said Mr. Macklin. "I don't have any money," said Harold. "We'll talk about that if you get in," said Mr. Macklin. He got in. He held the acceptance letter before him, as if it were a religious artifact, the Shroud of Turin. He told Mr. Macklin before he told his parents. Caltech gave him a scholarship, but there were other questions that presented themselves to him, one after another, about where he would live, about how he would eat. This was the Depression. Hunger was something to be concerned about. "I've spoken to Arnold already," said Mr. Macklin. Arnold was his friend from the Navy, who now worked as a lecturer at Caltech, and who was in need of help at the boarding house his family ran in Pasadena. "Harold could live there and eat there," said Mr. Macklin's friend, "in exchange for honest work." "You know you're not getting any money out of us," said his father, and that was all he said. "Goodbye," said his mother, in whom he could sometimes see reflections of Susan when she turned her head in a certain way, or on the rare occasions when she smiled. When he saw them, he looked away. They glinted too forcefully, like sun in his eyes. "I'll never be back," he wanted to say, but he felt it was better to say nothing. He hitchhiked to California. In 1936, Kansans were heading there anyway in droves. He was 18 years old. He had one parcel with him, a sort of bag he had made himself from bolts of oilcloth they had in the shed. He spent 4 years living and working at the boarding house run by Mr. Macklin's friend. Harold's housework was in mathematics. He fell asleep on his book, or coursework was in mathematics. He fell asleep on his books. He had never been happier. The thoughts he had suppressed for his whole life came bounding forth again. Forcefully, joyfully, as if they could sense that, for the first time, they might be welcomed. He met a graduate student named Ernest Clemson. Ernest, too, was studying mathematics. He was 6 years older, slight and serious, ponderous and still. He was brilliant. Everyone said it. He would go far in the field, they said. As an undergraduate, he had studied with Einstein. It was said, too, that Ernest was a natural teacher, that he would get the appointment of his choice. He had a beautiful, well-formed face and neat small hands with which he gestured gracefully while speaking. One night, taking a late, solitary walk together on the outskirts of Old Town, Ernest fell toward him almost with a cry of pain and kissed him. He said aloud what each of them had been thinking for some time. "I'm sorry," Ernest said. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It was the opening of a world." Harold was set to graduate in 1940 when the rest of the world was at war. Pearl Harbor was 1 year away. In the States, the draft had already begun. So, like all young men, like Ernest, he went that spring to his local recruitment office and registered. But the vision that had impaired him since he was young had worsened to the point of severe impairment when he was not wearing his glasses. He took them off and blinked into what had become an abstraction, a blur of middle distance. "You're blind," said the officer, "and you can't tell your colors apart either." For the first time, then, Harold wondered what he would do when he graduated. He spoke to Ernest, who said, a bit mysteriously, "Why don't you wait before making any decisions?" Ernest, unlike Harold, was in perfect health. He was drafted. Shortly before he graduated, Harold received a letter. He would wonder later whether it was Ernest's doing. He would wish to believe it was. The letter asked him two things. First, what languages he knew. Second, whether he would be interested in working for the United States government in Washington, D.C. "If so," said the letter, "please reply." "Yes," said Harold, "I am immediately available for employment and relocation if necessary." It was necessary. In 1940, shortly after graduating at the age of 22, Harold packed up and moved across the country from California to Arlington, Virginia. He said goodbye to Ernest, who 1 year later would be sent to fight in the Pacific Theater. For the next 10 years, Harold worked in intelligence for the United States government. First, for the Signal Security Agency, which swallowed the SIS. Next, for the U.S. Army Security Agency, which swallowed the SSA. Finally, for the Armed Forces Security Agency, comprised of all intelligence units for every branch of the military. He broke codes, Japanese mainly, but also German and also eventually Russian. He was good at his work. With William Friedman, he worked on the Venona project that broke Soviet codes emanating from New York. He was integral to the building of the Purple machine that was a replica of a Japanese encryption device. With this duplicate, the United States was able to decrypt information that contributed directly to American success in the Pacific Theater. He imagined, as he was working, that he was protecting Ernest. He worked harder. For the first years of the war, he and Ernest wrote long and complicated letters to one another. Both of them, in person, had been happily loquacious, talking to each other for hours in a tumbling, almost psychotic way, or psychic way. This tendency carried over into their letters. "Let me tell you about my day," Ernest might begin, and what followed was vivid, lucid writing, a detailed account of his every thought. They employed a code the two of them had invented years earlier, relying on words, not numbers. It went undetected by the censors who scanned the mail. Brother, they called one another, friend. In these letters, they made plans. Following the war, Ernest would get a job at George Washington University or Georgetown or American. Harold would go to graduate school after the war. Washington at that time was flourishing with men like them. Lafayette Square, DuPont Circle, Logan Circle, many of the public parks in the city. A community was forming. You'll see when you get here, wrote Harold in code. In 1944, the letters stopped. It took another 6 months for Harold to learn definitively that Ernest was gone, killed in action. Harold had no one, after all, to ask. Certainly not Ernest's family, whom he had never met, who did not know of his existence. At last, a friend of theirs was able to confirm it. Harold took 2 days off from his work, citing a stomach illness. He stayed home. He thought of Ernest. He thought of Susan. When he returned, he threw himself into his work. Arlington Hall was brimming then with talented people. And in them, Harold found friends. He sorted them out, assessing them carefully, wondering who might be an ally, deciding at last that there were several. It was at Arlington Hall that he first knew what it was to be in a lab. It felt like a team. At times, it felt like a family. There were several people there who were like him. Men who loved men, women who loved women. Temperamental, they called themselves, or homophile, or gay. The last was the first word Harold learned that felt correct to him. It was a nice word, he thought, appropriate in many ways. He liked the carelessness of it, the implication that their heads somehow they had their heads somehow above the fray, that they did not care what others thought of them. Outsiders referred to them differently. The lavenders said, or sex perverts, or queers. In 1946, he went with a colleague to the Mayflower Hotel. Oh, thank you again, Jerry. Hot pink, yeah. And he met George. George was sitting on a tall stool, wearing his hat indoors, grinning. He was younger, fashionable. He was, Harold thought, powerfully attractive. His gaze was steady and secure. The word beatnik hadn't been invented yet. If it had been, he'd have been one. Where Harold was conservative in dress, George was unsubtle. He wore mainly black. The length of his hair raised eyebrows. He wrote poetry. He was a talented artist. He made paintings on large canvases that it took 2 people to lift. Harold, at first, was skeptical of him. He seemed frivolous, cocky, too overt. He went with frequency to the chicken hut, a hangout so obvious that Harold avoided it. Why? George said, wrinkling his brow. Who cares? By that time, George had already cut off all contact with his family, wealthy New Yorkers, from a dynastic family who disapproved of him deeply. They had caught him with the boy, said George. They humiliated him. There had been a scandal already in the family, something about the father and a girl, and they were wary of another. They threatened to institutionalize him. Instead, they sent him off to a preparatory school in New Hampshire, from which he ran away when he was 17. They reported him missing. They said they could not find him. It was only when he became a legal adult, at 18, that he reemerged. He told them he had no interest in ever speaking to them again. In turn, they disowned him. This was the subject of one of the first conversations Harold ever had with him. Telling his story, George looked simultaneously amused and distressed. Emotions passed across his face like scudding clouds. George lived at the Hamilton Arms, a strange housing complex in Georgetown, a sort of commune populated by artists and scholars. The buildings were a collection of Alpine-style cottages, centered by a cafe called the Hamilton Arms Coffee House, where George also worked. There were murals on the walls, a pool perpetually drained in the middle of the courtyard. He brought Harold back with him that first night. Inside the gate, which locked behind them, were two women sitting in lawn chairs on the edge of the empty pool. One was smoking a pipe. Harold had never seen a woman smoke a pipe before. Helen, said George, nodding in her direction. And Helen, lanky, languorous, older than both of them, said, Who's the catch? Harold had never been referred to as a catch before. He reddened. George held the door to the coffee shop open for him. He ordered banana pie and Coca-Cola, a strange combination that remained in Harold's memory for years. He listened over a cup of coffee while Harold talked clumsily at length about his own family, about Ernest. You must miss him, said George. How old are you? Asked Harold. Wearily. How old are you? Asked George. 28, said Harold. 21, said George. A kid, said Harold, but in fact, when he looked back on that time later, they both were. They fell in love. George, as it turned out, was kind, endlessly kind, and endlessly willing to do what was just in the face of oppression. He was radical, carefree, braver than Harold was. He was exciting. Once, Harold smiled, remembering it. George kissed him full on the mouth. Outdoors, on the street, he did not believe in or bend to formalities or social niceties, and, therefore, he was sometimes perceived as rude. But really, he was just honest. He worked for equality in every pocket of the world. He lived as best he could. He told Harold, outside the confines of an oppressive, warmongering America, he joined the Communist Party, attended the meetings in the back room of a local bar, a fact that was first whispered about him and then spoken of overtly when it became clear that George did not care to keep it a secret. As much as he scoffed at tradition, though, George still bore the hallmarks of his upbringing. And though he was quite a bit younger than Harold, he taught him a great deal. It was George who taught him to make tea the way he would for the rest of his life. For example, it was George who taught him about classical music. One of their first outings together was to the National Symphony Orchestra to see them perform Beethoven's Fifth. George, who got Harold listening to the police dramas that he would enjoy for the rest of his life. Harold felt safe at first. In Washington, there was a community, a movement, the fellowship that Harold had mentioned in his letters to Ernest. The city felt modern. The war had ended. It was a new era. This sense of safety extended even to his work. There were several other men and women like him. He had even seen his boss, Conrad Louis, at the Horseshoe one night, although Harold normally avoided places as indiscreet as that one. He had been right there with George, tipsy, after a long night, and Louis had nodded to him from across the room. Harold did not approach him in person. There was no need to press the matter farther. Louis had looked stricken anyway, as if he didn't want to be recognized. Still, Harold took this exchange as a positive sign, a sign of an ally within the department. The rest of his colleagues, too, were intellectuals, progressive, subversive in their way. It was true they worked for the government, but it was with a sort of tacit agreement that they were doing it only to protect their peers. If they could prevent an attack on American soldiers, well, that was good and valuable work. When it came to the government officials to whom they reported, there was a collective eye roll, a kind of benevolent dismissiveness. Harold did not speak of George at work, except as a friend, but he felt there was an understanding with his closet colleagues that they were attached. Once or twice they were invited together to some social event. At night, they went to films, to concerts, to coffee shops or bars. They walked through the gates of the Hamilton Arms and felt as if they had entered an embrace. No one inside of it minded who they were, what they did. They had friends there, compatriots. They stayed up late in George's apartment in great numbers, talking, debating. Many of them, including George, were anarchists, revolutionaries. George had never paid taxes. On the premise that taxes funded wars, all the money he made was under the table. He operated entirely in cash. He maintained for the rest of his life. He did not begrudge Harold's tendency towards conformity. He insisted to each his own, said George. But if you get sick, said Harold, if you get caught, I won't, said George simply. Or sometimes, I'll go to Mexico, I'll go to Canada, I'll hide. Harold laughed at him, his impracticality, his idealism, his bravado, but then there was a part of him that admired George, that wished to be like him. George laughed loudly in public. He tossed his head back with pride that simultaneously alarmed and attracted Harold. Each morning, Harold left early from Hamilton Arms, trudging back to his place, feeling like he was awaking from a dream. He smiled at the memory of the previous night, took a quick shower, cold as often as hot. The building was old, the systems inside it unreliable, and then left again for work, and he felt, for the first time in his life, content. Long days of work ended in long, satisfying conversations, emotional and physical fulfillment, acceptance. They ate well, they slept well, they left the bedroom window open well into November and opened it again in March. In the late 1940s, the House Un-American Activities Committee turned its focus from rooting out Nazi sympathizers to rooting out communists, and in February of 1950, a senator from Wisconsin made a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, in which he declared that he held in his hand a list containing the names of 205 communists currently working in the State Department. At that time, there was an overlap in the mind of the public between communists and homosexuals, the term then used by politicians to signify deviance, perversion. Both categories triggered some deep-seated unease in the minds of both politicians and the public, some fear of the unknown. The Second World War had just ended. The Cold War had just begun. A specific campaign was begun to eradicate homosexuals from the State Department, especially those who dealt with high-level information. The stated reason: homosexuals were said to be weak, incapable of keeping secrets, or able to be extorted. Out of fear of their personal secrets being revealed to friends and family, or simply immoral, corrupt in some evil way, loyalty risks, they were called. A newspaper headline read, "Pervert Elimination Campaign Begins," and Harold thought abruptly of his father, of people like his father. Throughout the country, sitting by their radios, reading their newspapers, nodding, approving, urging McCarthy on. All around Harold, his friends in government, both gay and straight, began to make plans. The talk was low and furtive, in bars, at home. He began to feel paranoid, nervous, that he was being watched, being tailed. For several weeks, he stopped going to George's until his loneliness overwhelmed him. Then he only went after dark and left before the sun rose. What would he do, he wondered? What would he do if he was a part of the great felling that took place all around him? George didn't have to worry. He was an artist, a bohemian. He worked for no organization that could fire him. Aside from the coffee shop, which itself was owned by two radicals, he was lackadaisical, unafraid. Harold wondered if these qualities came out of growing up rich. "Just drop out of the system," said George one night, placing a gentle hand on Harold's head. "Just stop caring. Make a different living." Maybe I will, said Harold, but in fact the thought made him miserable. There was only one kind of work that satisfied him, and it was work of the mind, the sort that required the support of an institution. Without this kind of work, he sometimes thought he would go insane. If he were simply fired, that would be one thing, but the problem was not the firing, it was the blacklist. They kept you on it, Harold knew, for your whole life. It was a risk mitigation strategy. They didn't want their decryption techniques getting out, the high level information they all had access to. They wanted to stifle you, discredit you, make you look crazy. They made sure you never worked again. The first wave of firings at the Signal Corps took place in the summer of 1950, and it quickly became a plague. John and Larry, Eddie Towns, Margaret Grays, who was married for heaven's sake, but said to be masculine in some unquantifiable way. Eddie Towns came to George's apartment for dinner after he was fired, and he wept. What will I do now? He said. In the end, he moved back to North Dakota to help his father's gas station. This was a cryptanalyst like Harold. I'm next, Harold said, after Towns had left, still bleary and mildly drunk, giving them a brave salute from just outside the door. There was no question, he thought, that they would come for him next. He imagined a life without work, bleak and uninteresting and endless, a return to his dusty, blighted childhood. George contemplated him for a while. What if, he said, and took a breath. On October 9th, 1950, Harold arrived at work to find that two men in suits were waiting for him. The man on the left was wearing a toupee. Harold was almost sure of it. His hair sat on his head too heavily. He moved his head slowly, carefully. The other was handsome, impeccably dressed. Mr. Kennedy, said the first man, I'm Ted Doherty, and this is Art Tillman. We'd like to have a word. Moments later, a third person entered the room. It was Conrad Louis, Harold's boss, the same man Harold had seen at the Horseshoe. Briefly, he caught Louis's eye. That night, he went to George's house and told him what had happened. We know what you know, they had said. We know whom you shared it with. They were referring to the high-level information he had been intercepting for a decade. It was a lie. He had shared his findings, of course, with nobody, not even George. He never would. Tillman was holding a file stuffed full of papers, which he shook at Harold as if to indicate that it was full of evidence that could be used against him. It was a bluff. Presumably it was a bluff. Still, it shook him. A full investigation into these matters will be conducted in the coming weeks, said Tillman. In the meantime, your job will be suspended. I've done nothing, said Harold, holding open his hands, turning up the tender white palms as if to display their emptiness. When you have nothing to worry about, then you have nothing to worry about, said Doherty. Louis in the background shifted slowly back and forth. On the way out, Harold tried to catch his eye. He knew what was happening. Louis, alarmed, was framing him, pointing a finger preemptively, assuming that Harold would otherwise have thrown the book at him. I would have said nothing, he wanted to tell Louis, but Louis avoided his gaze. All of this, Harold told to George. So it's time, George asked. Yes, said Harold, I think so. They had put their plan into place several months before. There had been suicides already at the HUAC, or since the HUAC was formed. Among themselves, they never called it the House Un-American Activities Committee. They called it the Inquisition. 5, 10, 15 suicides within the State Department alone. There were men and women fired from their lifelong work, men and women who could not fathom another life. Some of the deaths were labeled accidental. Everyone knew the truth. They wouldn't notice another, said George, and at first Harold was confused. He did not understand. Are you suggesting, he said, wounded, And George shook his head emphatically. No, no, he said. I don't think you should actually do it, only that you might be able to make it seem as if it had been done. Harold gazed at him. It would blend in, George said. They wouldn't investigate it further. It wouldn't raise an eyebrow. It would make sense to them. He was right, Harold thought. They would think, of course. They'd think, what else did he have to live for? No family, no job, a sex pervert, a freak. They would be relieved. It would solve problems for the State Department, in fact. One fewer to worry about, one fewer to keep track of, an item crossed off a list. But then, what? Said Harold. What would I do next? You'd become someone else, said George. Who? Said Harold. There was a family friend of George's, whom George knew to be like them, a comrade. Don't say comrade, Harold had said. An ally, then, said George. Someone built like us. His name was Robert Pierce. George had known him since he was a child. He was powerful, said George, but secretive. Not even George's estranged parents knew the truth about him. But he and George were still in touch. Pierce had reached out to George when his parents first sent him away, offering him guidance, help, friendship. He had invited George to his town home on Beacon Hill for a weekend. He had introduced him to his partner, Jack Greer. He showed him an alternate way to exist. Since then, they had a correspondence. If there's anything I can do, Pierce had always said, he can help you, George told Harold. One weekend in August of 1950, 2 months before Tillman and Doherty arrived in his office, George and Harold had gone to New York City. It was an act of love on George's part. He had avoided the city for years, dreading an encounter with his parents, with any friend of the family. Well, here we are, he said, with something like a disdain, as they got off the bus. He took Harold to all the places he had frequented as a child. Write this down, he said. Memorize it until it's yours, then burn it. All weekend, George narrated to Harold the story of his life, and Harold took notes as avidly as a reporter. The name of every school companion, the name of every relative, the family tree, a chronological order of trips he had taken, places he had been, the places in New York that a family like George's might frequent. There was a conflicted pride in George as he showed Harold his old haunts. Here's where I went to church, he said, outside Calvary Episcopal. Here's where I went to school, he said, outside Trinity. Until they packed me off to St. Paul's, he said. Are you writing this down? He asked, and Harold assured him that he was. George had saved his house for last, wanting to wait until it was dark outside to venture there. Before they walked to Gramercy Park, they had a good dinner together near Union Square, in a sort of little bustling cafeteria, noisy enough to prevent their being heard. Later in life, he would stop into it any time he had an opportunity to go to New York City. He would take his daughter there. He would tell her it had been his favorite place, and from that moment on it was. Around them were young men and women who looked like George. When they were finished, George stood up abruptly from his chair and nodded toward the door. Are you ready? He asked Harold. The house was grander than anything Harold could have imagined. There it is, said George unhappily. The Sibelius homestead. It was dark outside, but the little lamps from Gramercy Park illuminated the area just enough for him to be nervous. He glanced over both shoulders repeatedly. Now you know what it looks like, he said. It's even more horrible inside. After a pause, they walked away together, the two of them, until they were certain they were out of sight. Then they paused, and George took Harold by the shoulders. Do you have any questions? He said. I don't think so, said Harold. Nothing I can think of right now. It's yours, said George. It's all yours. I don't want it any more. He looked tired. He looked like a man who'd been carrying a burden. Robert Pierce, George's family friend, was the president of the Boston Institute of Technology. When they returned from New York, George called him on the phone. Harold, in the background, listened anxiously as he explained their situation. George fell silent for a long time. When he hung up, he turned to Harold. Yes, he said, he'll help. For some time, they had a plan in place. It remained hypothetical, an unhatched parachute. For some time after that, it was something at least. It gave Harold some measure of comfort and control, some assurance that his professional life would not be over if he was fired. Are you sure you want to do this? Harold asked for the thousandth time, and George nodded emphatically. Every dollar George earned was off the record. His politics demanded it. Already he had invented a way to live outside society, in plain sight, in the middle of Washington, D.C. He intended to keep it that way, he said, for the rest of his life. You're young, said Harold. Suppose you change your mind. Oh, Harold, said George, don't patronize me. But he said it kindly, and Harold saw that he was serious. I can't find other work, said Harold. I can keep my name. Who will hire you, said George, without credentials, blacklisted by the United States government. They'll make sure you don't get hired anyplace. Then I'll become a hermit, said Harold, a mountain man. I'll solve math problems in my head from my perch in the woods. Don't be stupid, said George. A chef, Harold continued, enjoying himself now, but he knew that he would not be happy. His work made him happy. It was the only thing that ever had. You need my name more than I do, said George. Besides, he added, I hate it. I can't wait to be rid of it. And that's the truth. His name was David George Sibelius. He had always gone by his middle name. It was what his parents called him, for reasons he wasn't sure of. Professionally, he was already going by a different name, a brush name, he called it, since pen name didn't work for a painter. I'll go by David, I think, said Harold, as added protection. George shrugged. Whatever you like, he said. This, anyway, was what Harold told him. The truth was that George's first name appealed to him, containing, as it did, an allusion to someone facing odds that seemed unbeatable. The day after Tillman, Doherty, and Louis interviewed Harold, he and George put their plan into action. All right, I will end there for the night because the chapter's kind of long, I think. And actually, there's still quite a bit left in the book. This is to go. This is what we've read. So there's more secrets to get to. Half these senators were gays. Yeah. Well, you know what? I feel like the odds are there had to have been, And also, I like this twist too because it implies like his reasons for doing this, like he didn't commit a crime. Like not really. Like if there was a crime of being gay, like that's not a real crime, um it's not a crime like that's harmed anyone. It's literally just like a made up thing. So I feel like it allows for more understanding for the daughter to be like, yeah, that makes sense why you would have to do that. And you like, I don't know. I like it. It's interesting. You're seeing why he liked these places. I feel more sad for him because he was a nice guy. I feel sad that he had to die and had to keep these secrets. Um, but I guess he tells the machine who he was. That's his way of telling his daughter. And like I said, there's still plenty more to go. So, um, what he had to say, and I'm really curious too with the beginning with the daughter and how like. Anyway, I do have to pee. Call in tomorrow. Yes, I love you. I love this mutt. She's such a scaredy cat, though. She's so scared. This morning, they're working still on their roof, and I let her out because she had to go to the bathroom, and she got scared. She barked and barked at them and ran inside, and I found her huddled over here. I was like, they're not going to hurt us. But what she doesn't understand, she's afraid of. But I love you. I love you. I love you. And I love you. And I see you tomorrow. Mwah.